Now to Samuel. We're moving on from a rather different kinds of material to the one we've looked at so far. In the books we've looked at so far, we were thinking in terms of what the books refer to about the story of Israel and the backstory of Israel before Israel got into the land as its own land. Then the books of Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings tell the story of Israel in the land up from the time when under Joshua the people go into the land up to the time when they've lost it and they're back in exile and back in Babylon. And it's a rather sad story in a way. 2 Samuel comes at a high point halfway through that story, and it focuses on the story of King David, whose own story mirrors or epitomizes the story of Israel as a whole over that period. That is, in the first half of David's life, things go really well. David goes from triumph to triumph. David's a man who's really faithful to God. Until that faithful time when he gets himself involved with Bathsheba and ends up killing Uriah. And from then on, David's story unravels. It's a sad story afterwards. And as I say, in having that shape to it, David's story mirrors or epitomizes the story of Israel itself during its period in the land. And for that matter, David's story compares with the stories of Saul and Solomon, his predecessor and his successor, who also do really well in the first part of their lives, but whose story then unravels because of their failures towards the end. They are solemn stories for those of us who are involved in leadership, and for those of us who aren't involved in leadership, who need to be concerned for and praying for the people who are our leaders, because the pressures that come from inside us as leaders are ones that can easily lead us desperately astray. The high points of David's time, however, are twofold. The political situation in David's time is really great because now the people are in occupation of the whole land. David is able to make Jerusalem into his capital, and he's able to set up the arrangements for the building of the temple, though it's actually Solomon who will bring it about. And he's on the receiving end of fantastic commitments and promises on God's part. That, it's a neat story really. David says to God, I'd like to build you a house. And God says to David, well, I've got two problems about that. One is I don't really like houses, I like wandering about. But the other thing is that you've got the relationship between me and you back to front. I'm going to build you a house in the sense of a household. And the beginnings, you could say, of the promise to the household of David that issues in the promise about a Messiah and the coming of a Messiah is there in that promise that God makes to David in 2 Samuel 7, which isn't even undone by the grim things that follow. 2 Samuel.